Hello and welcome to episode 70 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR. As always, I am joined by fellow co-founder, the president of the world famous Top 150. It is Evan Silva, of course. Evan, what's going on?
What's going on, Adam? It feels like we haven't podcasted in a while because we podcasted really early last week, and then we're doing it in the middle of this week. But it's good to be back with you. It's good to be back talking some ball, and I think that the people are really going to like today's show. I think that people like it when we talk about making rankings changes, and we're going to be making rankings changes, a lot of rankings changes leading up until week one. The volume of the rankings changes will change dramatically when training camp begins. But there will definitely be, some tweaks made to the rankings based on news that come out over the next month and a half. And we're going to cover every single one. Actually, right now at EstablishTheRun.com, I'm working on a document that will turn into a column that has an explanation for every single rankings change within the top 150 leading up to and during training camp.
Yeah. That's great. And it sucks for me, there's no news right now. And that's why there's not a lot of changes. Like I saw a headline on Roto-World was like Matt Ryan talks to Todd Gurley on Zoom or something like that. And I was like, God, I mean, we've really hit rock bottom here when that is a headline, but we'll start to get a lot more news here. Hopefully as training camp opens in July. Before we get into today's shows, which will be about latest movers and shakers in the top 150, wanted to let you all know that our early bird package is now available. This will be by far our best deal of the entire season. You get our draft kit, which is a $30 value, our in-season package, $220 value, and the $25 FFPC coupon, all for $199. If you're interested in what's in our draft kit, or what will be in our in-season package, just head to the site. You'll find content schedules for both. We've added so much from last year, and we will be adding even more. We will be having some announcements soon. So stay tuned for that, about more stuff that we're adding. Anyways, head to establishment.com for tons more info on that. All right, on today's show, we are going to talk themes in early ADP and how Evan has adjusted his rankings lately. The first thing I wanted to touch on, Evan, is the season-long fantasy football market this year. In other words, ADP. I think there are some themes which we can hit on later, such as people understanding the value of quarterbacks more than ever in single quarterback leagues. I think people understand that more than ever now. I think tight end depth, you've hit on a little bit. There's, I've been doing some best balls, and, on the site, you can find all the data and all the research about how many you should take. I kind of like taking 3 in the flyer range of tight ends, but we can talk more about that later. But the thing that smacks you right in the face about the season-long market this year is the running back position, and specifically how many. I mean, just a raw number of how many running backs are going in the first 3 rounds. I do want to say that I like using real money ADP when talking about the market. Obviously, that's more accurate than some, mock draft ADP. On the site, we have FFPC ADP constantly updating, and I think that's really valuable. Now, FFPC is inherently RB heavy because you have to start 2 wide receivers. There's double flex, but still, listen to these stats, Evan. In terms of ADP, 11 of the first 15 running backs, 11 of the first 15 picks are running backs. 22 of the first 41 picks are running backs. Like the RB22, who's Le'Veon Bell in ADP, is going before the wide receiver 14, Adam Thielen. And then you have like very clear committee backs, Kareem Hunt, Mark Ingram, Damian Williams, Darius Geis, Keyshawn Vaughn. They're all going 7th to 8th round. I think it's very important. People are aware of this going into a draft, and we need to have a strategy. So I wanted to pick your brain on that for a little. Just first, what's your overall take on the state of the market right now, and specifically where running backs are going?
Yeah, I think that it's clear that this is the deepest tight end season that we've ever seen. I'm totally with you. I like taking, a couple of late tight ends to work together on my best ball teams, and every single time that I draft late, I go late at tight end, I end up liking my team much better than when I go early at tight end. And that includes even if I take like Evan Ingram in the 6th round. Every single time I like taking, Ian Thomas or Austin Hooper, who, by the way, is falling into the depths of the tight end 2 market.
Gesicki.
Gesicki, Jack Doyle, I think, has a 60 catch season in him. Chris Herndon, Blake Jarwin. I even think that Gerald Everett is going to smash his ADP. So I like taking, I'm with you that I like taking 2 or 3 late tight ends rather than going early at tight end. The wide receiver position, I think, is very, very deep. The quarterback position is always very, very deep, and the running back position is shallow. So this is a very simple case of position scarcity, and also in best ball leagues, like you can't use the waiver wire to go, pick up some great running back pickup, in free agency. I mean, we're working off best ball ADP right now, so naturally that is going to push job secure running backs toward the top of the board, and combine that with the position scarcity. And this is the most running back heavy year, according to the market, that it has been in quite a while.
Yeah. To be clear, the ADP, FFPC ADP I'm referring to is actually the $350 football guys season-long tournament, the one we were in last year. But yeah, the point is still well taken that the scarcity is what's driving running backs up. That said, I don't feel comfortable taking, Chris Carson, and I like Chris Carson, but I don't feel comfortable taking him over Adam Thielen or Juju Smith-Schuster. I just don't. But if I did that in every single round, well, I'd end up with an all wide receiver team. And I know when you first released your top 150, you had more wide receivers in the top 30, in the top 40, way more than the market did in ADP. And if you followed the ranking straight, which we don't recommend that people do, but if you were to follow your top 150 straight, you would have ended up with maybe one running back in the first 5 or 6 rounds. And I think that's a strategy that we're going to talk about more with Corain on Friday. On the site, you can find Corain's Zero RB article, but I don't think that's what you're necessarily trying to say. It's just from a raw perspective, wide receivers are going to be stronger picks than a lot of these running backs. From a position scarcity perspective, it's just different. So tell the people what you did to the top 150 and how you've adjusted it for the market.
Yeah. So first of all, you made a good point about ADP. Make sure your ADP is aligning with the leagues that you're within which you're playing. And I think most people are playing best ball ADP. So the ADP that I've been looking at has been for best ball. But yeah, that's an important point. Know the source of your ADP, for the ADP that you're using, for sure. I mean, I don't really use Fantasy Calculator anymore, but just know that ADP is produced by, probably less sharper players and by mock drafts, whereas, the ADP from FFPC is using data from people that at least have a little bit of skin in the game. About a month ago, we put up the initial post-draft top 150 on establishthерun.com. I wanted to see kind of how it would affect the market, and also just where the market stood. Came back and looked at it 2 weeks later and made a bunch of sweeping changes. One of the biggest changes is that I pretty much just ticked up almost every running back that has any significance, ticked them up a few spots with few exceptions. And that's because the market had spoken. And we don't want to get into a situation where, if you are drafting off the top 150, which we would much prefer you to draft off the tiers. I myself draft off the tiers as opposed to the top 150. I'll have the top 150 open when I'm drafting and checking guys off, and maybe if I'm in a tiebreaker situation, I'll read the little blurb next to the player. But my main, what I have directly in front of me is the quarterback tiers, the running back tiers, the tight end tiers, and the wide receiver tiers. And that's really what I'm using to dictate the drafts that I care about most. But yeah, we ticked up all the running backs because we didn't want people that do like to draft off the top 150 to get into positions where, if they didn't get a running back in the first round. And look, I still had 9 running backs out of 12 in the first round. But if you somehow usually it happens when you're drafting toward the back end of the first round, and say Devontae Adams falls to you at 9, or Michael Thomas even makes it to you at 9. It's really hard to not pull the trigger on that. But based on how the initial May 14th or 18th or whatever it was, you probably would have ended up with a running back or with a wide receiver in round 2. And I don't think this is a year where you can start with 2 or 3 wide receivers all in a row, unless you're truly taking a contrarian approach to your draft and employing actual zero RB, which really isn't even just 2 wide receivers starting or 3 wide receivers. It's like 4 or 5 big time wide receivers all in a row, maybe with an elite tight end mixed in. But we want to make sure that people get at least one good running back on their rosters. And so that's why we made that adjustment. And I also think you can build a really good team if you just within those first 5 or 6 rounds, you take one bell cow running back and you come back and you can piece together your RB2 situation with, I don't know, Damian Williams in the middle rounds, or Marlon Mack in the mid to late rounds, or, Chase Edmonds is a guy I like, Alexander Madison, his stock should rise, and throw a bunch of darts at those kind of guys. J.K. Dobbins, I think, is still priced relatively affordably. You can piece together your RB2 situation if you do want to go wide receiver heavy, because that's where I think that ultimately the value is going to come from because of the running back thirst. But yeah, we needed to explain all that.
Yeah, and I don't want to get into zero RB on here. I would recommend that you go to the site and read Pat Kerrane's article on zero RB and how it applies to this year if you're interested in that strategy, because it's going to be extremely, extremely contrarian this year. Obviously, the chalk construction season long is going to be get your running backs early, because you can get, Adam Thielen in round 4, or Calvin Ridley, or Tyler Lockett, because really good wide receiver options like Will Fuller or Devontae Parker or Michael Gallup can be had in the middle rounds, whereas, as Evan mentioned, the running backs kind of fall off a cliff. So that's going to be the chalk construction for sure, and that's something that Kerrane talked about in his articles, and we'll talk more about that next 2 podcasts from now will be with Kerrane about zero RB. I do recommend that everybody read the article, though. I think something important to understand, though, is like, I agree with Evan, like, his initial rankings, I prefer Julio Jones over, Derrick Henry. I prefer Adam Thielen over Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and Devontae Parker over Cam Akers, and Gesicki over Marlon Mack, or whatever. But I can keep saying that in every single round, right? That I prefer the wide receiver, or I prefer the tight option in that round better, because the RB market is so inflated. But at some point, we need the RBs. So, when do you want to take the worst option is going to be a question people are going to ask themselves. And again, we'll talk much more about this. As Evan mentioned, I think if you are waiting on running back and trying to implement some modified zero RB or contrarian approach, pass catching running backs are always, that's how you get Austin Eckler. That's how you get James White. That's how you get Tariq Cohen in 2018, Chris Thompson in 2017. Like, focusing on running backs who catch passes is going to leave you with way more upside if you miss or choose to go wide receiver with them early. But yeah, we have a lot more time to talk about draft strategy. I know most of you won't be drafting until August or September, and we'll see how the market moves. Speaking of moving, let's get into the top 150 movers and shakers. I want to start with the Dalvin Cook news, Evan. Dalvin Cook is somewhat unsurprising. I don't think it was shocking to anyone. Releases, obviously, through his agent to Adam Schefter and other Vikings reporters that he has no intention of reporting to camp unless a quote-unquote reasonable deal is reached. Of course, what is reasonable for a running back has been the subject of much debate over the last few years. Dalvin Cook suggesting he's worth Christian McCaffrey money is egregious, given that he's been hurt, given that they have such talented backups in Madison and Boone, and he's just not the same player that Christian McCaffrey is. And Dalvin Cook also has very little leverage because he can't even accrue a year towards free agency. If he sits out this entire year, he'll be a restricted free agent. And a running back as a restricted free agent is not going to fetch a pretty penny whatsoever. So I don't see what leverage Dalvin Cook has here. I still think a deal will get done, but I understand if people are getting kind of cold feet about Dalvin Cook. How would you play it if you were drafting now on Dalvin Cook, and did you move him in the top 150?
Moved him down a little bit. First of all, I had him as the number 4 overall player previously, and the number 4 overall running back, because all the top 4, actually all the top five players now in the top 150 are running backs, and then we get to Michael Thomas and Devontae Adams back to back. But I moved Dalvin Cook. First I moved Alvin Kamara from the number 7 overall player. This was part of the running back clean sweep. Moved him from the number 7 overall player to the number 5 overall player. So now he is ahead of Devontae Adams and Michael Thomas. And then when Adam Schefter reported that Dalvin Cook will not report to the Vikings without a reasonable contract extension, just that little bit of risk. And when you combine it with what Dalvin Cook already presents as risk, which stems from his injury history, which is significant. He has yet to finish an NFL season with without an injury, and he also, one of the reasons that he didn't go in the first round of the actual NFL draft and fell into he went in the 40s, I believe, to the Vikings, was because of his injury history at Florida State. He had multiple shoulder surgeries there, and then last year he had 2 shoulder surgeries. So you wonder if that is coming back to haunt him now. Combine that with the fact that there's at least a small chance, and I still think it's a small chance, but I think it's a small chance that he actually misses any games. This is a way of creating leverage. It's sort of a desperate way to create leverage because the new CBA makes it much more difficult for players to execute holdouts of training camp, because now it's not, hey, if you sit out 12 games or the full season, you lose your accrued year. But if you just sit out training camp, you lose your accrued year. I think it's a really small chance that Dalvin Cook holds out. But this is the best time in his life that he's ever going to be able to do this. This is the best way to create leverage, just to put a little bit of fear into the hearts of the organization that he wants money from. There are big problems for him, though. I mean, the Vikings just used a 3rd-round pick on Alexander Mattison, who had a fine rookie year. He runs really, really hard. He doesn't do a whole lot other than that, but he runs really, really hard. And then Mike Boone, who I know failed everyone in fantasy championship week through no fault of his own, by the way. The Vikings just played a terrible game. They got in the worst possible game script, and he flopped. I mean, that could happen to Derrick Henry. That could happen to anybody. And then he came back in week 17 and went off. But they've got 2 legitimate, and they've got Amir Abdullah still on the roster. So they've got like a legitimate 3-man backfield there that they can go into the season fairly confidently and run that out there. So I did move Dalvin Cook, not a lot, but I think he needed to move down a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, Dalvin Cook, I assume he's aware of what happened to Le'Veon Bell and what happened to Melvin Gordon. Like, Le'Veon Bell got embarrassed because they were like, fine, screw you, James Conner can do it just as well. And James Conner did do it almost as well. And Austin Eckler did it almost as well as Melvin Gordon. I mean, it's just, Dalvin Cook, I can see Madison and Boone just going in there and giving them 90% of what Dalvin Cook gave them for sure. Let's talk about Alvin Kamara. We haven't spent a lot of time on him this offseason. Famously, your boy Sean Payton called Alvin Kamara soft, but honestly, like, opportunity wasn't the problem for Alvin Kamara last year. Like, his touches were relatively close. His advanced stats were mostly the same, 2019 versus 2018. But last year, he only had 6 touchdowns on 252 touches. In 2018, 18 touchdowns on 275 touches. So people say Alvin Kamara had this horrible fantasy year. I agree he didn't look as explosive, but I don't really trust my eyes. And you could probably blame a lot of that on the ankle injury that he had. So Alvin Kamara up to 5th overall as Evan updates to get the rankings a little bit more RB heavy. Now he is ahead of both Michael Thomas and Devontae Adams. I feel pretty good about it. Evan, talk to me about Alvin Kamara's outlook this year versus last.
I mean, I think it's pretty similar, and I think that he is now ranked in a very similar range and as to when he was last year. It's just he wasn't as explosive last year, I don't think, and I think that was identifiable by not only the eyeball test, but how he performed in the passing game. Career low 6.6 yards per reception, from a yards per rushing attempt. It wasn't like he was great in 2017 from a yards per rushing attempt standpoint, led the league with 6.1, but he's been fairly just above average the last couple of seasons with 4.6 and 4.7 yards per target, 5.5, another career low. I think that it was identifiable both by watching him and by his production, particularly in the passing game, which is where we want to get our production from him anyways. And then just the massive touchdown regression. I mean, it was a windfall of touchdown regression for him over his first 2 NFL seasons. He had, including a return touchdown, I believe he had 32 touchdowns in his first 31 games. All of a sudden, he's got 6 in 14 games last year. That's a huge drop off. It was an okay fantasy season, but there were a lot of very reasonable explanations for his downturn. Most notably, the fact that he struggled through a high ankle sprain, which again, is the worst injury for skill position players, or at least for running backs and receivers. He also had a knee injury, and then just the natural regression. I think that he's going to bounce back strong. This offensive line looks as good as ever. They did move on from Larry Warford, but they replaced him with a first-round pick in Cesar Ruiz. All four of their other offensive line starters are back. They've got they're going to be a really good team, I think. They've got continuity at all the coordinators. I think it's time to go back to betting on Alvin Kamara, and we're back to betting on Alvin Kamara as our number 5 overall player.
I like it. Okay, speaking of injuries,
sorry, number 4 now. After moving him past Dalvin Cook. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah, number 4 overall. All right. Let's go to, speaking of injuries, let's go to James Conner. James Conner from 47th overall in the top 150 to 31st overall in top 150. As we've talked about all offseason with the Steelers stuff, I'm willing to throw out last season. Like when you play with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges, I'm willing to throw it out. The concern for me with James Conner is a long injury history, plus Anthony McFarland, who people like in the 4th round. Jalen Samuels, very good in the pass game. Benny Snell, who, I don't think is very good, but is at least there. And so I was a little bit worried on James Conner, but, Mike Tomlin came out and, maybe it's coach speak, but he says, listen, I like it better when we have a featured runner. It's better for our blocking scheme. Guy gets in a rhythm. I mean, Mike Tomlin has a long history, D'Angelo Williams and Levitan and all these guys of whoever was in there getting true feature back work like you don't see very often in the NFL. And he thinks James Conner can and will be that guy. I tend to believe him, so I agree that I want to move James Conner up. Biggest concern for me right now, I think, is injuries with James Conner. But, if you want James Conner, his ADP is rising very, very quickly. I know Evan's trying to stay ahead of it. Talk to me about James Conner, Evan.
Yeah, I mean, ever since we started doing these this year, I feel like I've been pretty clear that I want to stay ahead of ADP on James Conner because I think that, ultimately he's a fringe RB1 and he was being priced as like RB20 for a while. And I had him at, I don't know, RB18 or something like that. And I like being ahead of that, but I want to be way ahead of James Conner because I think that he's got a lot more equity. I didn't need Mike Tomlin to come out and say that. I actually don't like that he came out and said that because I suspected that James Conner was going to return as the workhorse anyway. And it wasn't going to be because Mike Tomlin was going to dictate it. It was because Big Ben was going to dictate it. And he's not going to want, little Anthony McFarland from Maryland in the backfield with him in crucial moments. And, maybe he could do with Jalen Samuels in those crucial moments, but he'd much rather have Conner out there. And Benny Snell, I mean, I'm not entirely sure that he's going to be on the 53. He probably will, but he'll probably be inactive on game days. I mean, Benny Snell stinks. So James Conner, I think, always was a good bet to come back and be pretty close to a true feature back in an offense that is going to have a lot more plays. They're going to run a lot more plays this year. They're going to score a lot more points. They went from having leading the NFL in receiving in passing yards per game in 2018 to finishing 30th last year with Duck Hodges and Mason Rudolph just not being able to move the ball. And yet and still, James Conner, through 7 games, was on pace for 1,408 total yards, 6 catches, and 14 touchdowns. Through 7 games, he hit just a blizzard of injuries, knee, shoulder, thigh injuries. He played 56 snaps the rest of the way. That's like one game. He essentially played one game after that the rest of the way. I guess you could use that against him and say, he can't stay healthy, but I would just rather bet on the upside. And I think that the upside is for him to finish as RB6 overall. And he's still a guy that his ADP is in the 17 to 19 range among running backs. What I did is I had him in this 3rd tier of running backs. It's mostly RB2 picks with RB1 upside, I call it. He was at RB18. I just moved him to the front of the tier. He was at the back of the tier, and I moved him to the front of the tier. And in doing so, moved him up about 15 spots in the top 150. And so we are now above consensus on James Conner, both from an overall standpoint and from an ADP standpoint. And I want to keep it that way. Now, there's a certain stopping point at which I'm going to stop moving James Conner up. But I think for people that are drafting right now, Like, I want you to be taking James Conner, like ideally at that 3-4 turn. That's where I got him recently, at 3.11. And I think he's a great draft pick there.
Yeah. One thing you can say about James Conner's opportunity is like, I love Miles Sanders. I love Joe Mixon. You can make a case that James Conner's opportunity ceiling is actually higher. Like, there's chances that James Conner can play like 95% of the snaps. Like, that's not happening with Miles Sanders and Joe Mixon, even though I absolutely love those guys and Nick Chubb and, all those guys. And you could say James Conner's path to that is at least better based on how Mike Tomlin and the Steelers have used running backs before, and the skill gap, as Evan mentioned, between Conner and the other guys.
Also at Sharp Football, the Steelers drew the second softest run defense schedule in the league. If you look at their early season schedule, it looks like they're going to come out and they're going to be able to throw the ball with efficiency and move the ball with efficiency, and that's going to give James Conner touchdown chances. They've got 4 or 5 starters on the offensive line returning. This is just a buy situation for James Conner. And again, pretty much every Steeler, from Juju Smith-Schuster on down to Diontae Johnson, who we're going to talk about in a second.
Yep. We'll talk more about Diontae in a second. Let's go to DJ Chark. You moved DJ Chark, a smallish move, from wide receiver 27 to wide receiver 23, but I think it'll open some people's eyes that you now have Chark ahead of Courtland Sutton. You now have Chark ahead of Michael Gallup, ahead of Keenan Allen, ahead of Steph Diggs. DJ Chark, obviously big-time second-year breakout last year, 73 catches, 1,008 yards, 8 touchdowns. They don't add a ton. They add Laviska Shenault. They add Chris Thompson. They add Eifert. I don't think any of them are huge threats to DJ Chark's target share. But yeah, it sounds like you're more optimistic, or at least getting more optimistic on DJ Chark. What's going on there?
Yeah, this is another situation where DJ Chark was sitting at the sort of the back end of his tier, and I just moved him to the front of the tier. And I moved him ahead of Michael Gallup, who, again, we are still way above consensus on him. And I hope that it stays that way, although it does seem like the market is starting to catch up, that Michael Gallup is just an absolute steal anywhere in the 30s among receivers. And we've got him comfortably, I believe, in the middle 20s among receivers. But with DJ Chark, DJ Chark has a much clearer path to being the number one receiver in his offense than does Michael Gallup. And I would say even Courtland Sutton. There's a lot more competition for targets in Denver now, and there really isn't in Jacksonville. I think that Leonard Fournette is going to cede a lot of his targets. I think that, and they really didn't make moves to go out and address. They're kind of bringing back the same guys: Chris Conley, Dede Westbrook, Keelan Cole. They didn't make huge upgrades aside from Laviska Shenault, who I think is going to be more of a gadget player early on. And DJ Chark is by far their best actual receiver. Jacksonville drew the lowest sportsbook win total in the entire NFL by a full game, and their win total is 4.5 games, right? I think that there is reason to believe that they are actually tanking. I think that if they weren't tanking, they would have signed Jameis Winston, or they would sign Cam Newton. I think that this, and again, it's a situation like Miami last year. You can't ask the players to not play their hardest. You can't ask the coaches to not coach their hardest, but the front office can make certain decisions that lower the win probability for their team. And I think that that's what the Jaguars are doing. But DJ Chark is just such a good bet because he's a young, ascending player. He's averaging, in his career, 14.2 PPR points per game with Gardner Minshew at quarterback, 5.9 fantasy points per game with all the other quarterbacks that he's played with. I think he's got a bankable rapport. He's an upward ascending player. He's the kind of player that I want to bet on. And I mean, I think that 150 targets in this situation where they're going to be throwing the ball a lot with Jay Gruden as their OC and playing from behind all the time. I mean, their defense has lost an unruly amount of talent in a short period of time. I mean, they've lost Telvin Smith. They've lost Jalen Ramsey and A.J. Bouye. They've tried to trade Yannick Ngakoue. They did trade Calais Campbell. I mean, the list goes on. And I think that this team is going to be true. I think they're the worst team in the NFL.
Okay, let's go to Mike Williams. Because I played Mike Williams a ton in DFS last year. He had so many air yards, and his yards per route run was 1.91, far better than DJ Chark for what it's worth. But quarterback change, I think, is the issue here. And you've dropped Mike Williams all the way down from, you had him wide receiver 43. I believe you now have him wide receiver 56, 120th overall. His ADP is wide receiver 45. So I think you're making a statement that you're completely out on Mike Williams. I don't think I disagree, given how many mouths there are to feed there. Questions about how fast Chargers will play, questions about whether Tyrod can support all these guys at ADP. It seems extremely unlikely. So Mike Williams gets a big boost down. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, and a lot of these decisions have been made. The rankings changes have been made because I've participated in my own drafts, and I'm on the clock, and I'm like, am I going to take DJ Chark or Michael Gallup? I have Gallup ahead of him in my rankings. I'm like, I can't justify taking Michael Gallup over DJ Chark. So I'll make that draft pick, and I'll immediately go to the rankings and be like, I'm going to not be. I want to be genuine to my audience and my readers, and I'm not going to have a guy ranked ahead of another guy when I would draft the guy that's ranked lower myself ahead of the guy that I have ranked higher. So I immediately made that change with DJ Chark, and I also made this change with Mike Williams because I'm just like, I do not want, I'm here and I'm about to make the 45th receiver pick in this particular draft. And I can look at like 8 or 9 guys below him, or maybe even more, that I would rather take than Mike Williams, because I don't want Mike Williams on my team this year, because he is, he did have a high yards per route run. I think one thing for context in yards per route run is that his targets were just so deep, whereas Chark can win in a lot of areas of the field. Mike Williams, when he catches one, he's spiking his yards per route run. I don't think necessarily he's a bad player, but I think he's a role player, and I don't want to bet on a role player in an offense quarterback by a low efficiency dual threat quarterback in Tyrod Taylor, or a developmental rookie playing with maybe limited preseason games and no offseason workouts, and who knows how many reps he's going to get in training camp. Like, that's not a situation that I want to bet on. I'm lower than consensus on pretty much every Charger skill position player. Austin Eckler, because of the running back clean sweep, did get moved up into a spot where he's kind of in line with consensus right now. But yeah, I'm way lower on Keenan Allen and Mike Williams than ADP. And I feel good about that, because I don't want those guys on my teams. I don't want those guys on my audience's teams.
Yep. By the way, Josh Hermsmeyer will be back this year with his air yards model, of course. I believe we may have redacted Mike Williams at some point last year. Obviously, redacted is just a joke when Josh gets extremely frustrated with a guy who has a lot of unsuccessful air yards. But yeah, agree with you on the Chargers stuff. All right. I want to talk about Diontae Johnson. We've talked a ton about Pittsburgh already. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but just Diontae Johnson in particular, because there is a ton of hype. I don't even know where this comes from. Just like out of nowhere, everybody's talking about Diontae Johnson, I guess because he revealed that he has sports hernia that he played through last year. But man, I mean, they added Chase Claypool. They have James Washington. They added Eric Ebron as a red zone threat. Vance McDonald was a disaster last year, but I still think he can play, and it was largely due to quarterback play. So Diontae Johnson now, you got to pay a pretty penny to get Diontae Johnson in some of these higher stakes leagues. People are very much onto him. You moved him up to wide receiver 34 from wide receiver 47. He's now in the same range as Marquise Brown, Jamison Crowder, Devontae Parker, Christian Kirk. I would personally take all 4 of those guys over Diontae Johnson, but I no longer think that is the consensus. Do you know why Diontae Johnson is getting so much hype out of nowhere in the middle of June?
Yeah, I think that I don't think it's out of nowhere. I think it's because how productive that he was with Duck Hodges and Mason Rudolph at quarterback, and now he's getting Big Ben, to give him a lot more accurate throws and to spike the Steelers' pass attempts. Because again, this is a team that led the NFL in pass attempts in 2018 with Ben Roethlisberger at quarterback. All of a sudden sank to the bottom of the league in pass attempts for obvious reasons, because it became minus EV to throw the ball, which is hard to do in the NFL. But that's what it was with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges at quarterback. And now Ben Roethlisberger is back. And look, there aren't guarantees coming with Ben Roethlisberger in terms of his durability, but in terms of how he is going to affect the passing game from a volume and an efficiency standpoint. Again, it makes this Steelers offense worth betting on. And Diontae Johnson is, a second-year receiver with no injury warts. He was electric in the return game in college, very, very good, with the ball in his hands. He played outside last year. He was not necessarily getting a bunch of high percentage, easy targets all the time. And he was just a ready-made route runner. He fits into that spectrum of players that the Steelers regime has hit on at the wide receiver position historically, whether it be Antonio Brown or Emmanuel Sanders or Santonio Holmes. He's sort of on that spectrum in terms of his game. Among rookie receivers, he had the most catches among all rookie receivers in the NFL last year. He was number 6 in receiving yards, had a bunch of touchdowns. I mean, he's a playmaker entering a much, much more favorable offensive environment. And he's a guy that, again, talking about the Steelers offense early on, I wanted to make sure that we, put him in a place in our rankings where our audience had a chance to get him. Now, the hype has pushed him up so high that right now we're still only about even with ADP. And I don't think I'm going to be pushing him up very much higher than this. But you're right. I mean, it's like every fantasy analyst now is tweeting about Diontae Johnson, and that took him from we had him as a value pick. The ADP moved him up to the point where we had to move him up to adjust for the market.
Yeah. As he continues to get rise, I'll probably be out on him in favor of some of the other guys that I mentioned, but we'll see. I think a spot where we're going to disagree here is on Ian Thomas. You moved Ian Thomas up to tight end 14 from tight end 17. I can't, in good conscience, take Ian Thomas over my boy, the athletic freak, Mike Gesicki. I just can't. Mike Gesicki is essentially lining up as a slot receiver. He's playing almost every down the stretch last year. He has Ryan Fitzpatrick, hopefully for an extended period, who just is a moneymaker for fantasy pass catchers. I mean, Ian Thomas had one good game last year, 557-1 against Atlanta, but he didn't exactly blow the doors off. He was actually kind of bad when Greg Olsen went down. So I think that I prefer Gesicki. I think I prefer Goddard, maybe. I think I prefer Hawkinson, maybe, to Ian Thomas. But maybe you can convince me why Ian Thomas moving up, why Ian Thomas over those other tight ends.
Another situation where he was at the back end of his tier, and I moved him up in the tier. He's right next to Gesicki right now. Over Ian Thomas's last 8 games that were missed by Greg Olsen. So it's an 8-game sample, which is a decent sample. Almost all samples are very, very small in the small sample size sport like the NFL, where it's 65 plays for each team and then the game's over. Everything, and there are big plays that skew small sample sizes and all that. It's very, very much a small sample size sport, only 16 games each season. I mean, I would say that even one season is a small sample size. I mean, and who wouldn't? Who can't think of some player that had one big season and just disappeared forever? But 8-game sample for Ian Thomas with Greg Olsen out over the past 3 seasons. Over those last 8 games, he has 35 catches for 364 yards and 3 touchdowns. So a 70-catch, 728-yard, 6-touchdown pace. I think that he runs routes in the area of the field where Teddy Bridgewater is going to be most comfortable throwing the ball. I think that this team is going to have to throw the ball quite a bit. I do think that they're going to be able to score points. There's a lot of playmakers in Carolina. I think that Ian Thomas could score 7-8 touchdowns, and I'm not sure that is necessarily in Mike Gesicki's range of outcomes. I think that the Carolina offense can be better than Miami's. I think that Mike Gesicki didn't really get going until Preston Williams got injured last year. So, I mean, again, I have them ranked right next to each other. Ian Thomas, a really good athlete, by the way, 91st percentile coming out of Indiana. So, I mean, I think that those guys belong right next to each other, and that's where I have them. Maybe I'll move Gesicki up a spot ahead of Ian Thomas, but yeah. I think that they're all really, really close.
Yeah, but Gesicki for me, I know I'm biased towards Penn State, but he's certainly a priority when executing a late round tight end strategy. Gesicki would be Goddard, would be Hawkinson, would be Ian Thomas, and then some of the other guys that that Evan mentioned in the back end, like Jarwin and some other later guys too. I mean, as we mentioned at the top, tight end is, if you like these guys, and I personally do, and Evan obviously likes Ian Thomas, I think it's an interesting strategy to play out this year. Let's talk Jimmy Garoppolo. You got Jimmy Garoppolo all the way up to QB 11 now, ahead of Danny Dimes, ahead of Ben Roethlisberger. Yeah, obviously, the thing with Jimmy Garoppolo is always going to be how many attempts he's going to have, because San Francisco played so well on defense last year. Turnover rate, 9 games with fewer than 30 attempts for Jimmy Garoppolo last year. And no matter how efficient you are, it's hard to have spike fantasy weeks when you have fewer than 30 attempts. Now, that said, when he was asked to throw, he had a 424-yard, 4-touchdown game against Arizona. He had a 329-yard, 4-touchdown game at New Orleans. Those were games when San Francisco's defense was exposed a bit. And I do think San Francisco's defense has the potential, like we've talked about, to take a pretty significant step back. So I'm not completely opposed to Jimmy Garoppolo. It just pains me when I can only project a guy for 20 to 25 pass attempts, even though it's not nearly as important of a opportunity-driven position like running back is or wide receiver. But still, it's a little scary for me on Garoppolos. But you have him up at QB 11 now. I believe that's pretty far above market.
Yeah, I think that this team is going to skew more toward a shootout, higher scoring team this year, and that Jimmy Garoppolo is going to have to play with more urgency. I also like his weapons a lot better than what he had last year. The 49ers traded up to add a first-round pick and then number 2 receiver role. Deebo Samuel enters his second season with the 49ers. George Kittle, go back and look at all the injuries that he played through last year. I mean, I think George Kittle has like a 12 or 13 touchdown season in his range of potential outcomes. And I think that could easily happen this year. You look at the rate at which he scored touchdowns at Iowa, it was just insane. And so far in the NFL, he's got 2, 5, and 5 as his touchdown totals so far. I mean, I think that if he, one of my favorite stacks, I think this year is going to be Garoppolo to Kittle in DFS in FFPC main event teams, because I think that this combination can absolutely go off. I think that Deebo Samuel can play a big role in all of that. You have one of the best orchestrators of an offense in the NFL as Kyle Shanahan. I really like the offensive line. They lost Joe Staley, but they brought in Trent Williams. And yeah, the efficiency that Jimmy Garoppolo was able to put together was just outrageous. First of all, he's now 21-5 in his career as a starter. The Kyle Shanahan scheme gets receivers in open spaces and capitalizes on their run after catch ability. No tight end is better after the catch than George Kittle. Brandon Ayuk had the most yards after contact of any receiver in the draft. You know how good Deebo Samuel was as a rookie, making plays after the catch. So all these personnel pieces all fit together so nicely with Kyle Shanahan's scheme. Last year, Jimmy Garoppolo, number 3 in the NFL in yards per pass attempt, number 7 in touchdown rate, number 8 in passer rating. They're defensively, they traded DeForest Buckner. Richard Sherman is a year older. That other cornerback position, they never settled it last year, and they really didn't do anything to upgrade it this offseason. I don't think he's going to lead the NFL in pass attempts, but if he can get up to like number 12 and maintain something in the vicinity of that efficiency that he posted last year, he's going to blow up. And I think that George Kittle can blow up. And I think that Deebo Samuel, we're above ADP on him. And then if you look at the weeks 1 through 6 schedule for Jimmy Garoppolo, week 1 at home against Arizona, I think he can light that up. Then he goes on a 2-game homestand or a road test at the Jets and at the Giants. Those both look like pass funnel defenses. And it's not a situation where they're going to fly back to San Francisco. They're going to stay in New York for those 2 games. I'm not even worried. That's early in the season. Not worried about that being. And they come back for 3 straight home games, at home against the Eagles, at home against the Dolphins, and at home against the Rams. Not worried really about any of those 3 defense. The Eagles have a talented defense, but we say that every year, and we smoke them with the passing game every year. Miami has no pass rush. The Rams lost Wade Phillips and a ton of personnel. So, and I have that rated as the number 1 quarterback schedule, the number 1 most fantasy-friendly quarterback schedule in weeks 1 through 6 in the entire league. I'm big on Jimmy Garoppolo. You can see that in the rankings change, and I also like him as a long shot MVP candidate. We talked about Josh Allen. I want to get a group of like 4 or 5 guys that, we're talking about as potential long shot MVP candidates that we can bet on 3 or 4 of them. Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be one of them. He's got the schedule. This is only his second full year under Kyle Shanahan. He's got the weapons. He's got the scheme. He's got the offensive line. He's got the efficiency from last year. Jimmy Garoppolo, add him to your list of long shot MVP bets. Josh Allen is to the point where he's starting to get not even to be a great value anymore.
Yeah.
So let's come back in. Let's hit him again with Garoppolo as a long shot MVP pick.
Only thing I'd add on Jimmy Garoppolo, president of Team Sex. I mean, Jimmy Garoppolo is out there on the team hard. And yeah, as Evan mentioned, MVP bets, Josh Allen, when we first started talking about it, was like 70-1. I haven't checked lately, but I'm sure Josh Allen's down in the 40s or something like that now. And yeah, Jimmy Garoppolo certainly in play, and make a lot of good points about his schedule and his efficiency for sure. I hadn't thought too hard about it, but I'll certainly be going back and evaluating Jimmy Garoppolo as a late round quarterback option. This next one I think is pretty simple to explain. Alshon Jeffrey and Jalen Reagor. Alshon, continued speculation this time from Jeff McClain that Alshon's foot will be an issue early in the season. We've gotten mixed signals from Eagles reporters. We talked before about the Eagles official website, what they said. Jeff McClain, one of the most solid guys on the Eagles beat, a couple weeks ago reported that Alshon Jeffrey's reasonable shot to start the year on PUP if they don't move on from him altogether. So obviously, with that news, I think Evan moved Alshon out of the top 150, Jalen Reagor up to wide receiver 46, 109th. Overall, seems like a pretty simple swap there. Evan, anything on the Eagles wide receivers?
Just got to the point where you were pressuring me so much to get Alshon Jeffrey. I had him like in the 120s. Every day Adam's sending me some text like, yo, look, this guy reported that Alshon could go on reserve PUP. I was just like, all right, man, I give up.
Yeah. We'll know for sure soon. Hopefully. But
that did like keep me thinking like, man, is it really worth, fighting this fight for an aging receiver who hasn't been able to stay healthy and is coming off a Liz Frank, and even if the reports seem dicey that, all of a sudden people know in May that Alshon Jeffrey is starting the season on reserve PUP in September, I kind of have skepticism of that. But I don't know, like the only upside that I can really imagine is him like somehow scoring like 10 touchdowns, because I don't think that he's got even 1,000 receiving yards in his range of outcomes anymore. And let's just go with the young talent. Let's bet on the young talent. They use a first-round pick on this dude, Jalen Reagor. I think he's a baller. I think it's an underrated pick by the Eagles. Let's just ride with him, and let's take our chances with him, and let's just pull Alshon Jeffrey. Let's put him on the do not draft list.
Yeah, I think that's good. And one thing always when you evaluate the Eagles, I know the Bucs keep talking it up. I know other teams won't say it. I know the Browns keep talking it up, but the Eagles actually execute 2 tight ends on passing plays. And I know a lot of that probably had to do with the lack of talent they had last year at the wide receiver position. They have Deshaun Jackson. Now they have Reagor. Maybe they have Alshon. But still, I think you're going to see Goddard and Ertz out there a ton. So Alshon being completely removed would be huge for Reagor, just because if they're going to run a lot of 2 tight end sets with only 2 wide receivers on the field, well, if it's Alshon and Djax, obviously Reagor is in big trouble. So something to watch for sure. Let's go to Le'Veon Bell, whipping boy of Adam Gase. And I love Manish Mehta, friend of the show. Manish Mehta just keeps publishing these articles about how bad Adam Gase and the Jets have treated Le'Veon Bell. I get it. You slid Le'Veon Bell down to RB23 behind David Montgomery, behind Devin Singletary. Obviously, they added Frank Gore. They drafted LaMichael Pirine. Then the beginning schedule, I know you've highlighted this a few times, but God, the Jets start at Buffalo versus San Francisco, at Indy versus Denver. Not going to be a pretty start, I don't think, for the Jets offense, which is sad because I do think that they do have some guys that I like on their team. I like Perriman. I like Herndon. But yeah, not looking great for the Jets, at least to start. Seems like you're trying to get below market on Le'Veon Bell. Is that right?
Yeah, and we were already a little bit below market, but then I started doing some, in my most recent drafts, Le'Veon Bell, I started to see him in the range, like, I might pick him. And I was like, I don't want to be in that range. So I'm actively doing drafts. I'm also doing the team previews which are coming along nicely. I'll start sending them along for to get published. Although this is by far the earliest that I've ever done them, and I'm kind of tempted to just wait and keep them in the hopper. But I don't know. I'll start sending them over. But as I'm doing the team previews and I'm writing up, Le'Veon Bell, and it's just the most depressing write-up that I've done yet. And I'm like, man, there aren't positives anymore. Even the greatest positive would be that he should have like 200 plus touches. But this guy averaged 20.7 touches per game last year and didn't help us at all.
Yeah.
And then the Jets talk publicly about wanting to reduce his workload. Adam Gase never wanted him in the first place. He didn't earn more touches for this year. I mean, 3.22 yards per carry, 4 touchdowns and 15 appearances was one of the weakest big play threats of any. You remember there was he had like 130 carries and didn't have had one gain of 20 yards at some point. And he had one of the least explosive seasons by a running back in the NFL this past year. And then they start talking about lowering his workload, and then they draft La'Mical Pirine in the 4th round, and they sign Frank Gore. So I think his touches fall from 20.7 per game to like 16. And 16 touches per game is really not going to help us in this Jets offense. The Jets have a brutal schedule. The running scheme, as management laid out, was never devised to benefit or to suit the strengths of Le'Veon Bell, who's really a gap runner, a patience-oriented gap runner, placed in this outside zone scheme where you're not supposed to be patient. You're supposed to make one cut and go. It's like the worst possible situation for Le'Veon Bell. And also, I think that you just watch him play last year, and I mean, he was never impressive last year. I thought from an athletic standpoint, after taking a full season away from football. What happens to your body when you're not training at an NFL level, when you're not taking hits? I think that maybe you can come up with theories as to why that might help a player. I think that there are also a lot of theories as to why that might end a player's career. And I wonder if that's what we're seeing develop with Le'Veon Bell right now entering 2020.
Yeah, I couldn't be more out on Le'Veon Bell. Totally agree with you. Will not be on any of my teams. Let's go to a more interesting situation. The Ravens backfield. Mark Ingram, you have at RB28 now, slipping a little bit. J.K. Dobbins at RB26. I think one thing you have to ask yourself here with both of these guys is, are you projecting any carries and touches for Gus Edwards? Are you projecting any carries or touches for Justice Hill, the 4th rounder in 2018 or 2019? Because, God, I could see them trying to use 3 backs in a game. I really could. Now, the other issue that I think you have to ask yourself, Baltimore just ran so many plays, 68 plays per game, and they averaged 3.8 touchdowns per game. I mean, easily the most in the NFL. I could see regression coming in the touchdowns department across the board for the Ravens. And I could also see them in far less blowouts where they were getting so many running back touches over the course of a game. All that said, they're still going to be very good. Mark Ingram and J.K. Dobbins, I think, are both going to be very efficient when they get carries. But talk to me how you're seeing this backfield now in Baltimore and what you decided to do with Mark Ingram.
Yeah, I think that Gus Edwards will still have somewhat of a role, but I think that J.K. Dobbins was drafted to just be they just drop in the upgrade on Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards moves down to number 3 on the depth chart. He gets mop-up / blowout work that Justice Hill got last year and wasn't very effective in, and Gus Edwards is really good in that specific role. But the reason that I made this change, I basically just flopped Dobbins and Ingram, is because I decided that I want to bet on J.K. Dobbins emerging as the best fantasy back in Baltimore. And Ingram to maintain some level of value. I still think that he's got pretty good touchdown equity. I don't think he's going to catch 5 receiving touchdowns like he did last year. That was insane. That will almost certainly go down as his career high. But yeah, he had 15 touchdowns in 15 games. He's going to hit some regression off that. He didn't catch passes last year. He averaged fewer than 2 targets per game. So he was living off touchdowns, and that's a tough way to live. Especially when now you're the second best talent in your own backfield. I think that, J.K. Dobbins is going to be better in the passing game than was Mark. What was Mark Ingram when he was with the Saints. I mean, he was a pretty replacement level running back, right? I mean, we knew he was solid, but we never really thought that he was a special RB. And then now, now I think that J.K. Dobbins does have a chance to be pretty special within the confines of this offense. The Ravens last year were number 1 in rushing DVOA. They're bringing back 4 or 5 offensive line starters. They are losing Marshall Yanda, which is a big loss, but they have continuity for the most part at that position. And I think that a lot of the, solid runs, like in between the 20s that Mark Ingram broke last year, when J.K. Dobbins gets those same plays, he's going to turn those into 20 and 30-yard gains and maybe even hit home runs on those plays. And I just think that the talent is sort of going to rise to the top. I think, as you said, J.K. Dobbins RB26, Mark Ingram now RB28. We'll still take Mark Ingram because he falls. He's not a sexy pick at this point, but he still does have, I think, 8, 9, 10, 11 touchdown upside. So I'm willing to take him. It's just I want him as my RB4 or RB5 and not as my RB2.
Yeah, the thing I liked about Mark Ingram in New Orleans was underrated pass catcher, man. People thought he was like this bulky, like kind of like too muscular guy. I mean, to me, Mark Ingram in New Orleans was a very good pass catcher. He's just not used like that. No running back is in Baltimore with Lamar Jackson. And also the regression in terms of just raw touchdowns. I mean, there's no way Baltimore's going to score 3.8 touchdowns per game again. Lamar Jackson's touchdown efficiency is going to drop really hard as well. And I could see their plays per game dropping pretty significantly as well. All right. Last guy we're going to talk about is maybe a guy a lot of people probably never heard of, but making his top 150 debut. This could be the biggest moment in Steven Sims' life, actually. Making his top 150 debut at 146 overall is Steve Sims, undrafted free agent out of Kansas in 2019. Makes the team late in the year, racked up at least 4 catches in the final 4 games. I think, to me, he's firmly ahead of Trey Quinn, and obviously you putting him in here makes you think he's firmly ahead of Trey Quinn as well. I could see Trey Quinn actually maybe not making this team, given what the Redskins did in the offseason. But anyways, Steve Sims, welcome to the big time, buddy. You're in the top 150. Evan talked about it.
Yeah, and maybe this guy will just be a little flash in the pan. I mean, at one point we had Jalen Hurd in the top end of the top 150 last year. Trey Quinn was at the end of the top 150 at one point last year. And Steven Sims, I think he's a wide receiver 67 or something like that. So he's just creeping in. But he is a guy who's got some PPR upside. First of all, look at what the Redskins did in the draft. All they did was they drafted D2
Antonio Gandy Golden, who has Corona. Golden. Yeah.
Right. And the history of like small school receivers drafted on day 3 is just non-existent. Like they don't work out. I'm not saying that Antonio Golden Gandy he has no chance. He actually does have a chance because he's the only guy that the Redskins added in their entire pass catcher core. So he's going to get opportunity that a lot of day 3, small school receivers didn't historically, get before him. But I mean, he's slow. I mean, he's a 4.6 flat guy, and Steven Sims is not a fast guy either, but he can win with the ball in his hands. He was a return guy in college, and he was really, really good, showed rapport with Dwayne Haskins down the stretch. So you have Terry McLaurin, who got a bunch of targets from Dwayne Haskins last year. And then the second most targeted guy by Dwayne Haskins last year was Steven Sims. And so it's an opportunity situation, and it's a situation where, hey, maybe here's a guy that can come out of nowhere, catch 75 or 80 balls last year, because that's kind of what the pace that he was on in the final month of last season, because he's got so little target competition. And that's where I'm kind of coming from on Steven Sims. Maybe he'll drop out at some point, but right now he's in there.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the back end of that top 150 is going to be fluid from Evan as we get more information on flyers and rolls and stuff like that. All right, that's going to do it for today's movers and shakers in the top 150. Reminder to go to the site, check out the early bird special. Draft kit is still available on its own. It's $30. Comes with a $25 coupon. As some people have said, I've been trying to talk Evan out of that $30 price tag on the draft kit for a while now. So get in there before I convince him, which should be relatively soon. So, for Evan, for producer Luke, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.